What's up guys, welcome back. Today we're going to look at how to create the striking non-metallic metal effect on these swords. To start, we'll take some of this scale colour Caribbean blue and we'll mute it down slightly with some of this Chimera red. So this is going to be our mid-tone. To create the shadow, we're going to take some of that colour and mix in a bit more red and a touch of black, giving us this dark desaturated violet tone. We'll paint that onto the upper part of each sword. So this colour is just going to be the dark area between our highlights on the blade. You don't want any lumps forming on the surface when you're doing this, so keep the paint fairly thin and use the side of the brush so that you can hit the whole area with minimal brush strokes. That'll ensure you get an even and smooth coverage. To continue, we'll take some of this secret weapon Red Rust and darken it slightly by adding a touch of red and a bit of black. We'll paint that onto the lower edge of each blade. In order to create a lot of contrast, we're going to keep this lower section quite dark, but we'll give it a warm browny red colour. This will give us the impression of the ground being reflected onto the blade. We're going to make this slightly more obvious later, but for now we're just blocking in a dark colour over the black to give us a starting point to work from. Now that we have those initial dark tones blocked in, we're going to grab our mid-tone and using a more standard layering technique, we're going to start pulling the paint over the surface so that we end our brushstroke in the spots where we want our highlights to be the brightest. So this blade on the left is fairly large, so we're going to create two bright points on the length. One here a little offset from the middle of the sword, and then one here closer to the hilt. Notice the way that I pull the paint up to the highlight from one side, and then I do the same thing from the other side. That way we ensure that we're leaving more pigment where we want the brightest points. When you're working with a fairly thin consistency, each brushstroke is going to leave a slightly transparent layer of paint while the brush is in motion, but the moment you stop to lift the bristles off the surface, that's the spot where you're going to leave most of your paint. You can use this to your advantage and build up a gradient simply by stacking transparent layers on top of each other, reducing their size as you progress through the layers. Always ending your brushstroke at the point where you want the highlight to be most intense. Just make sure to let each layer dry before applying a new one, or you run the risk of overworking the surface, which over time creates a gritty textured effect. While you're waiting, take a moment to move the model around and actually look at how things are progressing. You can ask yourself some questions. Are there any spots that you've missed or you need to work on? Is the gradient looking convincing? Can you see where the bright spots are meant to be? When you get a nice opaque coverage around where you want your highlights, it's time to start building the brightness. To do that, we're going to take some of this scale colour spring green and lighten it with some white, making it really quite bright. Mix that into your mid-tone, making a noticeable jump in value. It's important that you don't make this too subtle, otherwise your gradient will end up too gradual and you'll get more of a stony effect. To continue, we're going to paint a thin line across the width right in the middle of where we want to create our two highlights. You don't have to make them solid, just so long as you can see them. These are going to act as a visual reference that will make things a lot easier going forward. Now, these non-metallic metal highlights are usually more effective if they're not perfectly uniform in shape. Something I like to do is to create almost an hourglass shape so that they're wider towards the top and bottom edge. To make that effect, I typically start off by pulling the brush along the edge up to that guideline. We'll do the bottom edge first, so notice the way that I'm drawing the pigment up towards that guide mark so that I leave more paint right where we want the bright point to be. And I work from both sides of the line, pulling the brush along the edge, stopping when I hit the line. Then I repeat that same idea along the top edge. Again, pulling the paint up towards the guideline from either side. Drawing the paint in this way helps to create a subtle transition so that the highlight isn't the same level of intensity along the length. This gives you a way more interesting effect than if it's all uniform. To build the intensity of the highlights, something I like to do is paint thin lines along the length of the blade, making them slightly longer as I get closer to the top and bottom edge. If you imagine sharpening a sword, typically you grind the sharpening stone along the length, leaving lots of scratch marks following the shape of the blade, and this process helps to simulate that effect slightly. You can make it subtle or more pronounced, it's really up to you. To keep pushing those bright spots, we're going to use that same basic technique from earlier, pulling the side of the brush up towards that bright point, stopping our brush stroke when we hit that line, remembering to attack the highlights from both sides. You can also add some longer brush strokes near the bottom and top edge of the blade to emphasize that slightly curved hourglass shape. I'm using a fairly thin consistency for this so that I'm better able to control the transparency of the layers. If you like, you can add a bit more water, shifting it more towards a glaze, and use that to help correct any imperfections in your blend. Just lightly drawing it across the blade, always moving the brush in the direction of your highlight. This will help to soften out any areas where the edge of your layer is looking a bit obvious or rough. Depending on how thin your glaze is, it might take a number of applications before you start to see a noticeable difference. You can see that smaller highlight is slightly more derpy looking than the other one, so we'll be able to correct that with a few passes of the glaze. The blade's actually starting to look alright just with those two highlights on there. But we'll be able to make this even better as we continue to increase the intensity of our layers. Once you're happy with the blend, take a bit more of that light green and add it to your mix, making another significant jump in brightness. Again, with quite a thin consistency, we're going to start off by emphasizing that hourglass highlight shape we mentioned earlier. This time, instead of painting a guideline across the whole width, we'll make a small line near the edge, right in the middle of our highlight. Then we'll draw the side of the brush along that lower edge, pulling the paint up from either side of the line, essentially creating a small upside down T shape. This is the bottom part of our hourglass shape. Then we're going to repeat that same sort of idea along the top edge of the blade, again pulling the paint from either side towards the middle of our highlight. We'll also add another edge highlight here, just where the blade starts to curve down into a point, making the highlight brightest at the highest point of the curve. Notice we're just picking out the edge of the blade here. This will help to create contrast between the bright edge highlight and the darker tone on the face. To get a good non-metallic metal effect, you always want to be thinking about what you can do to increase contrast. It's a very key concept. Even if your highlights are in the wrong place, as long as you've built up enough contrast, you're still going to get the impression of a metallic surface. With that in mind, we can create contrast even along that thin edge. And we do that by varying the intensity of the highlights. Adding brighter dots and dashes just here and there really makes a big difference and elevates the final result. If it's just one continuous colour along the edge and there's no variation, it'll look a lot more sterile and you'll get a less convincing effect. To push the intensity of our main two highlights, we're going to draw the brush towards that centre point, holding the bristles at a bit of an angle, attacking it from both sides. We want the highlight to be brightest at the edge of the blade, so pulling the bristles down at an angle makes it easier to build up the pigments near that lower point. If you draw the brush in from the sides along the flat part of the blade, you'll end up with a bright line running across the width, which looks pretty cool, but it's not really what we're going for here. We'll keep working on this, applying thin layers of the paint until we're happy with the intensity of the highlight. You can see we're starting to get a more convincing metallic feel to the blade now. We still have some more work to do, but we're definitely headed in the right direction. When you're working with thin, fairly glaze-like paint consistencies, it's important that you vary the length of your brush strokes. So even though we're building up the brightness in quite a small area, I'll still occasionally do much longer brush strokes, drawing the pigments in from further away. This is going to help you create a smooth transition. If you always do the same brush stroke, the pigments will build up in the same spots, and after a few layers, that's going to result in a visible line at the edge of your layer. Alright, so we're just going to keep working on that until we're happy with the effect. Typically, I'll stop once I can no longer see those initial guide marks. If you like, you can also paint some of those thin lines running along the length of the blade. Just make sure you are targeting those two spots where the highlight is most intense. I think it's looking quite good now, so we'll take some more of that light green and add it into our mix. Again, making a significant leap in brightness. I'll use this to place a very small highlight right on the edge of the blade in the very centre of those two brightest sections. Usually when I apply very small highlights, I try to gently tap the surface. Using practice strokes where you're basically painting the air above the model really helps to get a light enough touch that you only leave a tiny dot. So you do these phantom brush strokes, looking at the point where you want to place your highlight and gradually lowering the brush with each stroke until you just barely hit the surface and no more. I find this technique a big help, especially when working on these smaller models. Alright, so I'll add a little water to that colour, thinning it down so it's more transparent. And then with a small amount on the brush, we'll gently draw up to that dot from either side. And we'll do that over a few layers until that dot starts to soften out. Now we're going to take some of that light green on its own and use it to place a small highlight in the brightest spot of the larger of the two highlights. And I won't bother with the other one. Remember, the idea is to create contrast. So here we're going to have a slight difference between the intensity of those two highlights. And that's actually another way of creating contrast, which I think a lot of people overlook. You don't have to have all your highlights be the same level of intensity. It's usually better if you have one really strong one and then have like a secondary one that isn't quite as strong. And that subtle variation tends to give you a more convincing effect. I'll add a bit of red into some of the red rust now, and we'll draw that down the lower part of the blade. Just carefully tidying up the edge of the blade where we might have gone outside the line slightly. But we're also making that warm colour on the lower part more obvious. We still want it to be quite dark, as that's going to boost the intensity of that brighter part. So we'll be careful not to make the colour too vibrant here. To finish this off, we'll take the bright green again and we'll carefully add some small highlights along the very edges of the blade. At this stage, we're trying to create a final little flourish of highlights along the edge, just to push the contrast over the finish line. Again, when you're thinking about adding contrast, don't just think in terms of light and dark. Try to think more about variation or difference. So here on the edge, we want to have lots of different dots and dashes of varying intensities, and that will help to give us quite a nice metallic effect. Now, I've phoned it in slightly on the hilt as I wanted more focus to be on the blade, as I think it's a much more interesting element. But if you're interested in how I painted it, I took some of the dark reddy brown tone from the underside of the blade and I painted that onto the areas where I wanted to create a highlight, just leaving any other section black. Then I mixed the lime green into that colour and increased the intensity of the highlight over a couple of layers. before finishing it off with a few simple edge highlights with the brightest colour. Alright, so that is how I painted this metallic effect on the sword blade. If you'd like to support the channel, gain exclusive access to longer ad-free video content, as well as automatic membership to our active Discord community, become a patron today for as little as $1 a month.